The winter of 1944 pressed down on eastern Poland with a cold that felt ancient. Snow buried the fields where crops once grew, and silence ruled the countryside except for the distant thunder of artillery. Captain Marek Jasiński crouched beside the burned-out shell of a farmhouse, holding the reins of a dark horse whose breath steamed in the freezing air. The animal's coat was nearly black, marked only by a faint streak of white along his muzzle. Soldiers called him Shadow, but Marek, who knew the animal better than any man alive, simply called him Partner. They had delivered coded messages past enemy patrols, crossed mine-ridden fields, and survived ambushes that no human scout ever forgot. Shadow had not been chosen for war. He had been found. Marek first saw him abandoned near a railway bridge bombed by German planes, terrified but uninjured, his ears flicking wildly at every explosion. Something in the horse's eyes alert, intelligent, unwilling to surrender made Marek take him in without hesitation. From that day horse and soldier became inseparable. Officers shook their heads in disapproval. Modern war belonged to machinery. Panzers, half-tracks, tanks, engines. Horses were relics, symbols of cavalry that belonged to another century. Marek didn't argue. He saddled Shadow every morning and let results speak for him. On a gray February afternoon, Marek received orders impossible to refuse. A reconnaissance unit had been cut off near the village of Lipany, surrounded by enemy armor. Radio signals were jammed, and lines of communication were dead. The only hope lay in delivering coordinates for Allied artillery to fire. Using an old forest route German tanks could not enter, trucks would never make it. No motorcycle could pass the woodland marshland. Shadow cooled. Marek folded the paper into a small oilskin pouch, slipped it inside his coat, and stroked Shadow's neck. The horse turned his head, as if sensing the urgency and danger of this mission. The first leg of the journey was no birds, no voices, only the crunch of hooves in snow. Marek's thoughts drifted to Poland before the war. A house near the smell of hay in summer, his younger brother laughing in a stable. That life felt centuries away. Now every decision was survival, every breath uncertain. As dusk fell, Shadow's ears perked. Marek leaned forward in the saddle. In the distance, engines rumbled, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the frozen ground. Tanks were moving somewhere ahead of them. Marek slid off the saddle and pressed his cheek to the horse's shoulder, steadying his breath. He knew that sound. German Panzer IVs, moving in a slow, coordinated formation. He had faced armored divisions before, but never this close, while carrying something that could change the course of a battle. He peered through a stand of dead pine trees. Metal forms emerged from the twilight, whiskers of smoke trailing behind their exhausts. Shadow did not bolt or panic. He simply watched, muscles ready, waiting for direction like instinct guided him. Marek whispered, "Easy, boy." His fingertips trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. If the tanks reached Lipany before he did, men would die hundreds, maybe more. Shadow stamped once, breath rolling from his nostrils like steam from a locomotive. There, in that frozen forest, while machines of war crept closer, one man and one horse prepared to move. They would not turn back, because turning back had never been an option. The forest ahead was a maze of skeletal trees and snow-cloaked mounds that hid more than fallen branches. Marek tightened the reins and guided Shadow away from the rumbling engines, keeping to the shallow slopes where the horse's steps would not crack hidden ice. The sky had begun to darken into a bruised purple, and every sound seemed magnified in the cold air. He listened for snapping twigs, boots, or the metallic grinding of tank tracks, but all he heard was Shadow's careful breathing and the dull thud of hooves on frozen soil. Somewhere to the west, a flare rose briefly, its red streak fading into the darkness like a warning sign from another world. Shadow moved with purpose. As if he understood the map Marek carried. The horse's body heat warmed Marek's legs, a comfort against the chill that penetrated even his thick coat. He recalled how Shadow once navigated a collapsed bridge by instinct, weaving through gaps barely wide enough for a man, much less a horse. That memory grounded him. This mission demanded that same intuition. Behind them, artillery popped faintly, distant but steady. The war was a constant heartbeat under every moment of stillness. Marek's breath formed clouds in the air, each one a reminder of time slipping away. By the second hour, the terrain changed. Snow gave way to frozen mud, pocked with hoofprints old, but fresh enough to signal that other Polish units had passed recently. Marek hoped they made it through. He thought of the men in Lipany, young scouts, barely trained, ordered to hold their position while encircled by German armor. Some had probably never seen a tank up close before this nightmare. The message Marek carried included fire coordinates, but also a coded phrase that confirmed the presence of Allied artillery ready to strike. If he failed to deliver it, the guns would never fire, and the men in Lipany would vanish from history without a name or a grave. Shadow halted suddenly, ears rotating. Marek held his breath and listened, straining to separate imagination from danger. At first, there was nothing. Then, a faint clanking echoed through the stillness. Metal on metal. Marek dismounted and crouched amid the underbrush. Across a narrow clearing, he spotted two silhouettes German infantry, rifles slung, helmets dusted with frost. They walked slowly, scanning the shadows, unaware of the man and horse concealed in the trees. Marek placed his hand on Shadow's muzzle, calming the horse's instinct to move. The patrol paused, spoke briefly in low voices, then continued along a trail leading away from the forest route. Only when the crunch of their boots faded did Marek exhale. He stroked Shadow's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath warm skin. "Good boy," he whispered. Every second now demanded quiet precision. Discovery would mean capture or worse, interrogation and confiscation of the message. Marek remounted and urged Shadow forward. The horse obeyed without hesitation, stepped sure and silent, as if he sensed that failure here would cost lives far beyond this forest. Ahead, the pines thickened into a black wall of trunks. Somewhere beyond that barrier lay Lipany and the tanks closing in. Marek felt the urgency sharpen inside him. He tightened the reins once more, and Shadow broke into a trot as night swallowed the last light of day. They would not stop until they reached the men counting on them in the dark. Night came quickly in the Polish winter. The forest turned into a corridor of shadows, every tree resembling a rifleman waiting in silence. Marek guided Shadow along the narrowest paths, those barely visible under the snow. Knowing that German patrols favored the wider trails that allowed easier passage, a thin crescent moon offered little light, only a silver outline on the horse espa, and the faint shimmer of frost clinging to branches. Marek's fingers were stiff from gripping the reins, his knuckles aching in the cold, but he refused to dismount again. Speed mattered now. Every minute surrendered to the dark tipped the balance against the men trapped in Lipany. Far behind them, artillery thundered again, distant concussions that rattled the frozen earth. Marek paused, listening not to the explosions themselves, but to the pattern. 3 shells, then a pause, then 2 more. It was a signal he had learned months earlier, a Polish unit warning any friendly forces within earshot that enemy armor was advancing in columns, not scattered patrols. Shadow reacted too, ears flicking backward, muscles shifting under the saddle, as if he registered the threat in the very rhythm of the blasts. Marek leaned forward, whispering words of reassurance. He barely believed himself. They reached a swampy clearing, a place Marek knew well from previous missions. In summer it was a marsh that could swallow wagon wheels whole. But in winter, frozen hard, it offered a secret passage across terrain no vehicle could use. Marek urged Shadow on, feeling the horse test each step before committing his full weight. Steam curled from Shadow's nostrils as he breathed in the icy air. Marek adjusted the small pouch inside his coat, making sure the coordinates remained safe. The paper within represented hundreds of lives and a sliver of hope. Without it, artillery would fire blindly into the woods, accomplishing nothing but noise and wasted shells. Halfway across the frozen marsh, a sharp crack splintered the quiet. Marek pulled back instinctively, Shadow dropping into a tense stance. Was it ice breaking? A rifle bolt. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing among trees and water. Marek scanned the darkness, fingers brushing the pistol at his hip. He saw nothing, only snow, tree trunks, and the endless black that swallowed detail. Shadow's tail flicked, hooves scraping lightly against the icy surface. The horse was alert, but not panicked, and Marek trusted that instinct more than his own hearing. Slowly, he guided Shadow forward again. Every step, a negotiation between courage and survival. When they reached solid ground, Marek allowed himself a breath. He glanced upward through the branches. The moon had vanished behind clouds, leaving nothing but a pitch-black sky. He wondered how the men in Lipany were faring. Were they counting ammunition, whispering prayers, or sitting in silence, accepting whatever fate approached through the snow? Those thoughts haunted him more than any German patrol. Men could endure fear, but waiting without certainty was its own kind of torture. The forest closed around them like a fist as Marek and Shadow continued deeper. Ahead, a faint yellow glow flickered between the trees. Not fire, not a flare. Something else, maybe a lantern. Maybe headlights, shielded by canvas. Marek slowed Shadow to a walk, heartbeat pounding in his ears. The glow pulsed once, then again, like a signal no one had taught him how to read. They were getting close to something, whether salvation or danger. He could not yet tell. The glow ahead became clearer with every cautious step. Marek slowed Shadow until the horse moved in near silence, hooves placing themselves deliberately among roots and dead leaves. The lantern light appeared to sway slightly, as if held by someone walking back and forth. Marek's mind raced through possibilities. German scouts setting an ambush, a villager searching for lost livestock, or perhaps a Polish partisan hiding from patrols. Trust was a fragile currency in these woods. He dismounted and took Shadow's bridle in hand, leading him forward on foot. Snow creaked under Marek's boots, and he winced at the noise, wishing he could silence the winter itself. As they approached a clearing, Marek recognized a shape, a man wearing a heavy coat and fur cap, pacing beside a makeshift lean-to constructed from canvas and pine branches. The man turned at the sound of Shadow's breath and raised the lantern higher. Marek braced, hand hovering near his pistol, but the figure stepped closer and whispered in Polish, "You're late." Marek's relief was immediate, though tempered by suspicion. He identified the man, Corporal Jerzy Krowik, a courier known for navigating enemy lines. He was lean, sharp-featured, and carried the exhaustion of someone who had not slept in days. Jerzy glanced at Shadow with a nod, recognizing the horse's reputation, even in dim light. Marek led Shadow into the lean-to's cover. Jerzy pointed toward a dirt path, just beyond the clearing. "Patrols doubled tonight," he murmured. "2 squads, maybe more. They're searching for something." Marek understood instantly. Someone must have intercepted fragments of radio chatter. German intelligence might know a message was moving through the region. Jerzy reached inside his coat and produced a folded scrap of paper, edges stained with grease. "Updated coordinates," he said. "Your map is 2 days old." Armor shifted north after midday recon. Marek replaced the old slip in his pouch and tucked the new one carefully beneath his layers. The mission had just changed. Failure would no longer mean arriving too late, would mean arriving in the wrong place entirely. Shadow snorted softly, stamping a hoof. Marek ran a hand down the horse's neck, grounding himself in the heat and steadiness of the animal. Jerzy's lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the trees. The wind picked up, carrying distant sounds. An engine revving, a shouted command, a sudden burst of gunfire that cracked like splitting wood. The Germans were close. Too close. Jerzy's gaze hardened. "You need to leave now," he said. "Take the ridge route above the ravine. It's narrow, but tanks can't climb it. Only a horse could manage that path." Marek nodded, fastening his coat, and tightening Shadow's cinch. Jerzy extinguished the lantern, plunging the clearing into darkness. The forest felt larger without light, a living entity holding its breath. Marek swung into the saddle, and Shadow shifted under him, ready for motion. "See you on the other side?" Jerzy whispered, but Marek knew there was no guarantee of that. He urged Shadow forward, guiding the horse toward the ridge, away from the fleeting safety of the lean-to. Behind them, the last ember of lantern glow vanished. Ahead lay only snow and shadow, and somewhere beyond, men waiting in Lipany for a message that would decide whether they lived or died. Shadow's hooves bit into the frozen earth, steady and sure, as Marek steered them toward the ridge and the unknown dangers that waited in the dark. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged rise of earth and stone cutting through the forest like the spine of some ancient creature. Marek guided Shadow toward it carefully, scanning the tree line for movement. A bitter wind scraped across his face, carrying the metallic tang of distant machinery. He could still hear sporadic gunfire behind them, faint but unwavering. Somewhere back in those woods, Jersey was either already gone or already fighting. Marek pushed the thought aside. There was no room now for imagination, only momentum and purpose. Shadow approached the base of the ridge and snorted, breath flaring in the cold night air. The first stretch of climb was deceptively easy. The ground offered just enough traction for Shadow's hooves to grip frozen roots and patches of earth. Marek leaned forward in the saddle, giving the horse balance and space to choose his steps. The ridge path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single man in places. Tanks would never reach it, as Jersey had said, but infantry could, and that possibility weighed heavily in Marek's mind. He remembered missions where a single misplaced rock or a snapped branch revealed everything. Tonight, every sound could decide the fate of men waiting hours away. Halfway up, Marek pulled Shadow to a halt. Below them, through gaps in the trees, he saw a convoy of German vehicles crawling along the main road. Armored cars, troop carriers, and at least one Panzer IV. Their engines created a steady drone, accompanied by headlights chopping beams of white through swirling snow. Marek held his breath. They were close, too close for comfort. Shadow stood still as stone, ears flicking but body calm. Marek rested a gloved hand against the horse's neck. The animal's steady pulse grounded him, reminding him of every narrow escape they had survived. When the convoy finally passed, Marek nudged Shadow onward. At the crest of the ridge, the forest changed character entirely. The trees stretched taller and closer together, their trunks forming vertical walls that blocked both wind and sight. The air smelled different, wetter, almost like thawing wood. Marek recognized the signs of a stream somewhere nearby, hidden beneath ice. Streams meant low ground, and low ground meant a possible crossing point to reach Lipany without drawing attention. He consulted his memory of maps, real ones and mental ones tracing paths from previous reconnaissance. Shadow's steps remained confident, as if he too recalled the safest route through unfamiliar terrain. A sudden crack tore through the quiet, followed by a metallic clatter. Marek froze, heart racing. A single rifle shot echoed, distant but directional. Then came another, sharper, closer. Marek slid from the saddle and crouched low, drawing his pistol. Shadow lowered his head but did not panic, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Marek heard men shouting, Polis's voices this time. A small skirmish was unfolding somewhere beyond the ridge, likely a partisan clash with a German patrol. The noise sent adrenaline surging through his body. He could not get caught between two fighting groups, not with the message in his coat. He inhaled slowly, thinking through options. Retreat was impossible. Waiting risked interception. Only one path remained: forward, through sound and uncertainty. Marek holstered his pistol and mounted again. Shadow responded with immediate motion, trotting along the ridge with a grace that defied the danger beneath them. The night pressed in around them, filled with echoes of conflict and the faint, constant hum of war machinery. There was no turning back. Not for either of them. Every step carried them closer to Lipany End, to whatever fate awaited at the end of the frozen road. The ridge descended into a shallow valley where the air felt warmer, though snow still blanketed everything. Marek guided Shadow downhill, boots brushing against low branches. As they moved, he could hear it before he could see it, a faint trickling, like glass beads falling on stone. The stream Jersey had hinted at was here, hidden beneath a crust of ice. Marek dismounted and knelt beside it, brushing snow away from the water's edge. The ice was thick in places. Teeny otters, a dangerous trap for anyone careless enough to assume safety. Shadow lowered his head and sniffed, his breath fogging over the frozen surface. Marek considered their next move. They could follow the stream north, hugging its bank until they reached the outskirts of Lipany. It would be slower than cutting straight through the woods, but safer. Tank crews would avoid frozen waterways, and infantry tended to patrol roads rather than these concealed natural corridors. Marek studied Shadow, watching the horse's ears twitch toward the distant rumble of armored engines. The animal had survived artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and smoke-filled battlefields. Tonight, Marek trusted Shadow's senses more than maps or orders. They started along the water's edge, the stream whispering beneath the ice. The path was narrow and uneven, forcing Marek to walk on foot while Shadow followed closely. Every so often, he pressed a hand to the horse's flank, as much for reassurance as for support. He watched the forest constantly, alert for silhouettes or sudden flashes of light. A single glimmer of a helmet or rifle barrel would mean turning back corps, fighting for the chance to continue forward. He kept one hand near his sidearm, but he hoped it would not come to that. Marek had seen enough bodies in snow to know how quickly a mission could become a memory. After an hour, they reached a bend where the stream widened into a shallow pool frozen solid. On the far side stood an old sawmill, burned to a black skeleton years earlier. Charred beams leaned at odd angles, and the roof had collapsed inward. Marek paused, studying the ruin. It provided cover dangerous, but necessary. He led Shadow to what remained of a doorway and peered inside. Ashen frost covered the interior, and broken saw blades lay half-buried in snow. But something else caught his eye. Tracks, not animal tracks. Boots. Several pairs, heading west and disappearing into the trees. Marek's pulse quickened. These tracks were recent. Maybe hours old. They could belong to partisans retreating after a skirmish, or German scouts checking the area for hidden routes. Shadow snorted, ears flicking toward the north, where headlights flickered faintly through the pines. Marek crouched low, listening. Voices drifted across the air, German, urgent, commanding. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. A search was underway, and the sawmill sat squarely in their path. He needed to decide quickly. The smart move was to wait, let the patrol pass, hope darkness kept them invisible. But time had sharpened into a blade at his back. The men in Lipany might already be out of ammunition. Marek stroked Shadow's muzzle, feeling the horse's heartbeat under his palm. The only route left was the one surrounded by danger. He tightened his gloves, checked the pouch with the coordinates, and exhaled slowly. The forest groaned with distant activity, but Marek and Shadow moved anyway, slipping from the sawmill into the darkness, heading toward the faint sound of flowing water and the promise of survival just beyond it. Dawn arrived without light, only a dull gray haze that filtered through clouds swollen with more snow. Marek and Shadow had followed the stream for hours, the sound of water beneath the ice becoming a steady companion. The forest thinned ahead, revealing low fields beyond the last line of trees. Somewhere past that open ground lay Lipany. Marek could smell smoke, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. It wasn't the acrid scent of burning fuel from German machines, it was wood fire. Human, desperate. It meant men were still alive, defending themselves through a winter night. Shadow halted at the tree line, ears pricked, staring across the field. Marek crouched beside him and scanned the horizon. The land was scarred. Frozen trenches, drifts of snow concealing abandoned carts, and shattered fence posts leaning like gravestones. In the distance he spotted the outline of a grain silo, half collapsed, marking the edge of Lipany. Marek's heart kicked hard. They were close, but terrain ahead offered no cover. Any movement across that open field could attract gunfire. He needed a sign that friendly eyes were watching, not enemy ones. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small mirror wrapped in cloth. It wasn't military issue. He had taken it from his brother's home years ago, before war swallowed everything. Using light signals was old-fashioned, but effective. Marek angled the mirror toward a faint glow atop the grain silo. One flash, then two, then one again. A signal known among Polish scouts, friendly presence, awaiting confirmation. The seconds crawled. Then, from the silo, a reply to flashes, pause, then two more. Relief washed through Marek. Lipany still held. Shadow pawed at the snowy ground, sensing tension turn into possibility. Marek stroked the horse's neck, grounding them both. He studied the tracks near the stream, hoof prints, wagon wheels, and the sharp edges of boot marks. Someone had passed through recently, likely partisans ferrying supplies or messages under cover of dark. Marek thought of Jersey, and wondered if he'd made it out of the woods. The memory of the lean-to and lantern flickered in his mind. Every ally lost along this mission weighed heavier than the cold. Marek mounted Shadow and kept low in the saddle. They needed to cross quickly and silently. He surveyed the ground, mapping a route that hugged the shallow dips in snow where meltwater would collect in spring. Shadow stepped forward with measured grace, hooves muffled by layers of powder. Halfway across, the wind shifted abruptly, and with it came a sound Marek recognized instantly. Tracked vehicles clanking against frozen earth. A German column was approaching from the north, engines revving, voices barking orders. Marek's gut twisted. They were arriving at Lipany too. He urged Shadow into a faster pace, pressing forward as the world narrowed into a tunnel of urgency. The grain silo grew larger, clearer, more detailed. Bullet holes peppered its stone surface. Smoke curled from shattered windows, and a narrow doorway was flanked by two figures with rifles raised. Marek heard a whistle signal. He raised his hand, showing empty palm, and Shadow broke into a final trot toward human shapes emerging from the haze. Behind them, metal roared. A reminder that the horse who had faced tanks once would do so again before this was over. Two Polish scouts met Marek and Shadow at the silo entrance. Rifles slung, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. One was barely older than a boy, his cheeks hollow from hunger, and eyes too old for his years. The other was a sergeant, thick-shouldered, wrapped in a torn greatcoat. Marek slid off Shadow and handed over the signal mirror in greeting. They didn't waste time on questions. Everyone here understood what silence meant. The sergeant gestured toward a narrow gap in the stone. Inside. Quickly, Marek led Shadow through the slit where the silo had cracked from mortar fire long ago. The interior was cold, darker than the forest, lit only by faint sunlight creeping through irregular holes in the walls. A handful of men huddled around a stove built from bricks and metal scrap. Some wore Polish army uniforms, others civilian jackets stolen or borrowed. They looked up as Marek entered, eyes widening at the sight of the horse, then narrowing when they saw the pouch under Marek's coat. A lieutenant stepped forward, gaunt-faced, one arm in a sling. "Did you bring coordinates?" Marek nodded and reached for the oilskin pouch. The lieutenant exhaled, relief visible, though tension remained etched into every line of his face. Maps littered a makeshift table parchment, scraps of envelopes, corners of old newspapers. Marek placed the updated coordinates down and explained Jersey's warning. Armor shifting north, patrols doubling, the ridge route barely holding. The lieutenant listened, jaw tightening. "We expected armor," he said quietly. "We didn't expect them this soon." He motioned to a radio set in the corner, its wires exposed and battery near dead. Communication died at midnight. Artillery won't fire without confirmation. Marek felt a weight settle in his chest. He had traveled through hell to deliver a message. Now another obstacle waited in this broken silo. Outside, Shadow stamped once, hooves scraping the floor. One of the younger scouts hurried over with a handful of oats and a bucket of melted snow. Shadow lowered his head and began to eat, muscles still quivering from the journey. Marek knelt beside the lieutenant and traced a line along the map. "Artillery is south of Kremyu," he said. "If we can send Signa by flare from the ridge, they'll adjust their fire." The idea was simple, but dangerous. Flares would draw attention. German armor, now closing in, would react instantly. The lieutenant weighed the choice, eyes flickering to the shattered windows where gray daylight seeped in. A rumble echoed outside the telltale grinding roar of tank treads on frozen earth. One of the scouts flinched. The sergeant cursed under his breath. Marek thought of all the miles behind him, all the hidden paths, all the patrols avoided. He looked at Shadow, who lifted his head with ears alert, calm despite the growing noise. Marek knew then what had to be done. He would ride again, not away from danger, but toward the ridge that overlooked Lipany. The lieutenant nodded once, as if reading Marek's thoughts. "Go," he said. Make the signal. We'll hold them off until artillery wakes. Marek tightened his coat, checked the flare pistol strapped at his hip, and walked toward Shadow. Outside, the ground trembled under advancing armor. Men whispered prayers, loaded rifles, and braced for the inevitable. Marek swung into the saddle, gripping Shadow's mane. It wasn't courage guiding them now. It was necessity, the kind forged in frozen silence and carried by a horse who had stared down tanks before. Together, they surged out of the silo toward the ridge, where life and death would soon meet. Snow whipped across the open ground as Marek and Shadow burst from the shattered doorway of the silo. The rumble of German armor grew louder, a metallic growl that shook frost from branches and sent vibrations through the frozen earth. Marek leaned low over Shadow's neck, urging speed while choosing a route that would keep them out of sight of the approaching column. The air smelled of gasoline and burning rubber. Somewhere behind them, Polish scouts scrambled into positions, rifles aimed, hearts pounding with the knowledge that this battle would come quickly and brutally. Shadow climbed the ridge with steady, relentless strides, muscles firing beneath Marek's legs like pistons. Marek listened for infantry boots or shouted commands, but the dominant sound now was the grinding of tank treads against ice. A flash of movement suddenly cut across the slope. A German spotter crouched behind a fallen tree, binoculars raised. Marek's pulse surged. He couldn't stop, couldn't hide. He drew the flare pistol from his coat, gripping it tightly as Shadow thundered past. A shout went up behind them, followed by a crack of rifle fire. Splinters flew from a nearby stump as bullets struck wood. At the crest of the ridge, the view opened wide. Marek halted Shadow just long enough to take in the battlefield below. Lipany looked cornered. Defensive trenches outlined in gray, smoke curling from shattered roofs, tank silhouettes crawling toward the village. Marek could see a makeshift barricade where partisans and Polish scouts crouched, weapons ready. They were outnumbered 2-1 at best. Artillery was their only hope. Marek raised the flare pistol, breath catching in his throat. The sky overhead was a blank slate waiting for fire. Before he could shoot, a second rifle shot rang out, closer, sharper. Shadow jolted hooves, skidding on frozen soil. Marek pivotted, spotting movement on the ridge trail they had just climbed. 2 German infantrymen sprinted uphill, one reloading while the other leveled his rifle. Marek had seconds. He fired. The flare shot upward in a brilliant streak of red, bursting against the gray sky. The sound was strangely small, a single pop against the roar of engines below. But it was enough. The signal had been made. Shadow lunged forward as Marek guided him along the ridge, using terrain to shield them from incoming fire. The German soldiers shouted curses, scrambling to adjust their aim. Marek ducked low, hearing bullets snap past his head. Shadow's breath blasted hot into the cold air, steam rising like smoke from a locomotive. Below, German tanks shifted direction, some aiming their cannons toward Lipany, others pausing, uncertain. Marek prayed that somewhere, miles away, an artillery officer had seen the flare and understood the message. He guided Shadow toward a cluster of boulders where trees offered partial cover. Marek's hands shook not from fear, but from adrenaline and exhaustion. He peered over the ridge again. A new sound joined the chaos, a distant thump. Then another, like thunder traveling underground. Artillery. It had begun. Faint flashes glimmered far to the south, followed by delayed explosions near the tank line. Fire blossomed across the frozen field where armor had gathered moments before. German formations scattered, tanks veering sideways, infantry diving into snow. Shadow stamped once, body tense but eyes steady. Marek exhaled, feeling relief crash through him, though danger was far from over. This might turn the tide, but only if he and Shadow survived the ridge. More shells landed, shaking the ground. Marek glanced at his partner. "One more run," he whispered. If they could descend safely into the village below, there was a chance to see the outcome of the message they had delivered through ice, darkness, and steel. Together, they prepared to descend the ridge while fire rained on the battlefield. Artillery fire rolled across the valley in waves, each blast sending echoes through the ridge as Marek and Shadow charged downhill. Smoke blossomed where shells struck frozen soil, lifting clouds of ice and dirt. German armor staggered in confusion, engines screaming, as tanks tried to reposition. Marek steered Shadow through the thickening haze, every hoofbeat carrying them closer to the shattered village. He kept his eyes forward, scanning for movement, allies, or the telltale muzzle flash of incoming fire. The ground trembled beneath them, but Shadow never faltered. The horse's single focus seemed almost human, reached the men who had waited through endless night for that signal flare. They entered Lipany through what used to be a livestock yard, now a ruin of splintered fences and burned-out wagons. A scout waved them through a breach in a crumbling stone wall. They saw it. He shouted, pointing south toward the distant flash of Allied artillery. Marek nodded, dismounted, and led Shadow toward cover inside a collapsed barn. The air was thick with smoke and cordite, and distant screams punctuated the roaring chaos. Men hurried past carrying ammunition. Wounded soldiers leaned against walls wrapped in dirty bandages, and everywhere there was the urgency of survival, clinging to each breath. Shadow lowered his head to sniff the ground, ears twitching at each explosion. Marek stroked the horse's neck, anchoring himself in that familiar presence. He remembered how Shadow had looked the day he found him, abandoned near a railway bridge, trembling but unbroken. War reshaped men, but it had revealed something different in this animal determination beyond instinct, loyalty beyond training. Marek's thoughts broke as a blast rocked the barn, debris raining down. A sergeante yelled tanks, pushing west. We need to hold until the next barrage. Marek knew what that meant. Artillery would adjust based on observation. Someone had to direct the fire. He grabbed the radio handset, its battery flickering weakly, and shouted coordinates through wavering static. Target marked by flare. Repeat target marked by flare. The response was buried in static, but unmistakable. Acknowledgement. Marek hurried outside, Shadow trailing beside him like a silent sentinel. Outside, the bombardment intensified. Shells landed in a tight pattern, cutting a swath through advancing armor. A panzer groaned as tracks snapped, smoke belching from its turret. German infantry scrambled behind wreckage, trying to regroup under relentless fire. The sky was streaked with dark smoke and columns of flame that danced in the winter wind. Marek turned to Shadow, feeling for the first time the possibility that he might survive this day. The horse lifted his head, nostrils flared, eyes locked on the battlefield below. There was no Faerunli readiness. Another shell struck, shaking the earth. Then a sudden quiet followed, a lull so deep Marek could hear his own heartbeat. The German assault was breaking. He could sense it in the shifting movement, in the shouts of the scouts, in the way the smoke began to drift rather than surge. Lipany might hold, after all. As the final shells landed and engines sputtered into silence, Marek rested a hand against Shadow's muzzle. "We made it," he whispered. Around them, men emerged from trenches and ruins, coughing, staggering, but alive. The radio crackled again, a distant voice given a simple confirmation. Artillery standing by. Marek looked toward the ridge where he had fired the flare, then down to the horse beside him, a partner who had refused to retreat, even when machines of war closed in. In the smoke and snow of Lipany, Marek understood the truth. History would remember battles and commanders, but he would remember this journey, built on courage, silence, and a horse who had faced tanks and never turned away.